They called them soft. Crates stenciled with blocky English letters showed up at a muddy railhead east of Moscow just after New Year's, 1942. The seals broke with the pry of a bayonet, and the smell of salt and diesel bled into the cold. Men crowded close, steam curling from breath, great coats shiny with frozen sleet to see the latest trickle from across the ocean. Inside lay boots, shiny, pliant leather over rubberized lowers, double rows of metal eyelets, padded tongues, removable felt and canvas liners. A joker in the back whistled. "Good for a dance hall," someone said. "Good for a parade on Broadway," another added, and the laughter rolled down the line. Real winter boots, the veterans insisted, were made of felt as thick as a wrist valenki that rose like towers and turned clean snow into a friendly road. Or they were the old ankle boots with puttees, iron-nailed and stiff as a rulebook. These American things bent in the hand. They had no hobnails to bite ice, no comforting hardness. Soft, the word returned with a frown, as if softness were not just a quality of leather, but a moral failure. The quartermaster didn't argue. He scratched names in a dog-eared ledger with a pencil cut to a nub and slid pairs across the plank. Outside the sheds, the steppe was an ocean of black earth, in its treacherous season, Rasputitsa, when roads, remember, they are fields and swallow wheels, trucks bogged to the axles. Horses blew steam and stood trembling in harness as men laid down, planks like stepping stones that sank the moment a boot left them. The calendar insisted it was deep winter. The weather argued. Daytimes thawed, nights skin puddles with a thin glass that lied under morning boots. Misha, 20, a private in a rifle company that had already sprinted and staggered more in 4 months than he had in his entire life, took a pair because his old boots had split at the welt during a short redeployment that stretched to 20 kilometers. He worked thumb and forefinger along the American liner, surprised at the stitched heel cup. He rolled down his sock and winced at a blister he'd been pretending wasn't there. "Keep them for the thaw," his squad leader said, half amused. When the ground chooses mud over ice, Misha nodded and tucked them away. When it froze hard, he would beg, borrow, or trade for valenki like everyone else. The front nearby was quiet in that tense way that means it's listening sporadic mortar puffs, a horse stumbling, a machine gun test burst 2 villages away. Orders said, hold the road, keep the culvert from blowing. Rotate a platoon through the roofless farmhouse with the cracked iron stove. Men came off sentry with boots steaming, set them too close to the iron belly, watched the leather warp and split. Set them too far, watched the humidity creep in and rot seams from the inside. Trenchfoot was a phrase that tasted of another war, but the body did not care which year a lesson was learned. Toenails went black, skin peeled in gray ribbons. Pride made jokes thinner every night. It was the in-between that broke them. On clean, creaking snow, felt was a king. In slush that turned to water by noon and to glass by dusk, felt drank and froze on the foot. A section on Culvert guard learned it the stupid way. They came off post with valenki heavy as buckets and ankles numb up to the calf. The medic swore, cursed the weather, then the supply chain, then everyone born west of Arkhangelsk. He cut socks carefully, warmed feet with hands, and told them to stop pretending they were iron. Misha tried the soft pair on the third night. He drew the culvert. The leather flexed instead of fighting him. The rubberized lower shrugged off the black water that oozed through the plank walkway. He could feel the cold. Yes, he wasn't a child, but the liner wicked. And when he came off post, he could pull it out, steam it by the stove, and swap in the spare set he'd stuffed under his tunic to dry against his ribs. An older sapper watched him do it and pretended not to approve. "Tricks," he grunted, but he asked very casually whether the crate had held any size 42s for a comrade. The laughter didn't stop. It changed. They still teased the eyelets and the blunt civilian toe. They rolled their eyes at the way the tongue folded like a wallet. But more of them wore the Americans on the meanest days, drivers who stood in oil-wet slush, signalers who waded ditches to lay line, the poor devil on the culvert whose post was part river, part road. A rule emerged without anyone writing it. Felt when the world was honest snow, soft when the weather lied. Numbers moved in ledgers before opinions moved in mouths. The quartermaster's pencil marks shifted sizes claimed twice, lost in transit notes that meant traded over a cigarette, more requests for extra liners than any sheet officially listed. Somewhere far away, in Murmansk or Arkhangelsk, cranes were lifting more crates off freighters, longshoremen coughing in the wind as they worked under blackout lamps. Lend-Lease moving at the speed of convoy and argument. None of that appeared in the trench. What appeared was a second pair of liners drying on a string near the stove, a corporal who stopped limping after a week, a sentry who could still feel his toes at dawn. And then winter remembered itself. The warm wind died, clouds cleared, and the world set like poured tin. Snow squeaked under heel. Chimneys inscribed gray lines into a sky so pale it hurt to stare. Out on patrol, the air rang with that brittle, quiet, only true cold can make. Valenki climbed back onto calves and sat there, tall and kind. Men blessed them without words. The Americans went back into corners, onto drivers' feet, into the closets of those who had decided they'd rather endure blisters than blasphemy. It lasted 6 days. On the 7th, the wind veered, the thermometer sulked, and a mist moved in that turned every road into a skating rink with a film of water on top. Trenches became troughs, dugouts wept. A regimental messenger went down hard on a slope and slid 20 meters into a puddle disguised as drifted snow. When they hauled him out, he carried another kilo on each shin, and the creative profanity he unleashed named saints and commissars equally. Misha didn't say anything. He pulled the felt liner from his soft pair, wrung it once, slid in the dry set from under his tunic, retied the double-looped eyelets his comrades mocked, and went back to the culvert. The storm made a steady hiss on the road. Somewhere an engine coughed to life. Somewhere a captain practiced a speech for the next briefing. The war wasn't waiting, it was testing. And the lesson that arrived not with speeches, but through souls and skin, was simple enough for a private to learn. Sometimes the hard thing is admitting that softness, properly used, keeps you moving. The first man to stop joking was not the loudest. He was a mortar gunner named Kolya who'd spent 3 winters on the Don before this one and wore his experience like another layer of clothing. He'd mocked the boots hardest, American galoshes with officer laces, until the night his team had to hump crates along a causeway that was more water than road. The sled runners shrieked over ice, stuck in gravel, then skated again. Kolya fell twice, once so hard he saw a constellation that wasn't in any book. At the culvert, water burbled black under a skin of glass. They were already late, and late meant a captain who wrote your name down. Kolya stepped off the plank, sank to mid-calf, cursed, expected the cold to bite straight through. It didn't. The rubber lowers shed the worst of the sludge. The liner drank what got past and stayed warm. At the next bend, he turned to say something clever and found nothing came. He trudged on, boots squeaking, the crate pressing a bruise into his thigh, and realized he wasn't doing the little ankle dance he always did to keep feeling in his toes. When they dumped the mortars and powder at the forward pit, and he finally spoke, it was only, "We'll make a second run." No one laughed. Little proofs accumulated like hoarfrost on wire. A driver climbed down from the cab after 12 hours and did not pour water from his boot tops. A telephonist came back from wading a ditch and didn't rip skin off with his sock. A squad on outpost duty learned they could strip liners, shove them under tunics, and rotate dry into wet at the half of a watch without begging space by the stove. A sapper figured out that if you scuffed the rubber on gravel for a few strides before stepping onto glare ice, you raised a faint tooth of grit that bit where hobnails would have skated. The quartermaster started hiding a dozen pairs under a tarp and gave them out on loan to men posted to bridges and culverts. He wrote the fiction into his ledger with the fatalism of a man who understood both winter and paperwork. "Temporary issue," he muttered, pencil scratching. In the next column, he added a private notation only he could read, "Toes kept." Pride fought back the way it always does. An old corporal with Valenki to the knee and a face soldered into a permanent squint sniffed at the double eyelets and said the Americans didn't understand real cold. 2 days later, he limped, Then the medic lanced a blister above the heel while the corporal scowled at the wall. Soft, he said again, but it landed without force, like a shovel into drift. Orders came down to push a patrol past a river that couldn't decide whether it was liquid or glass. The map showed a ford. The river showed a sawtooth of black lanes and white traps, brittle ice edges puckered by the current. The lieutenant, a quiet man whose handwriting stayed neat even when his hands didn't, took 2 teams. One went light in felt, the old way. One went heavier in the American boots, with spare liners tucked under shirts. Halfway across, the felt men slowed. Snow on ice became slush under snow. The felt drank. The toes went dumb. The ankles said lies about their strength. By the far reeds, they shuffled, stamping the way men stamp when they are afraid to break anything more. The soft team moved steadier, planting, testing, stepping. On the far bank, a German flare clawed the clouds and fell with a hiss. Everyone flattened, noses in frost, hearts loud enough to be heard if anyone had been close. When they crawled back, the felt team's prints were frantic, where the ice had grown honest and skinned itself to water. Nobody wrote a report about boots. The lieutenant mentioned foot condition adequate once, and went on about fields of fire and a machine gun that had learned their patrol times too well. But in the dugout that night, the joke shifted key. No one said the American boots were better. They said, give the new ones to the river team, which is the same thing with fewer syllables. The weather kept teaching. The big freeze returned like a general reasserting command, and felt rained again on long, squeaking marches over honest snow. Men came back, pink-cheeked, breath-plumed, bragging about rhythm and distance, their steps thumped neatly into the crust. Then a fog rolled up from the lowland that hadn't been in any forecasts, and for 3 nights running, the world lacquered itself into treachery before midnight and sweated by noon. Valenki froze into their own shape as soon as you sat still. The American boots didn't stay dry. Nothing stayed dry, but they forgave you faster. A rumor ran through the regiment that the boots had been designed for swamps, for faraway places where rain forgot itself on good days and remembered on bad. No one knew if it was true. They repeated it anyway, because it explained why the rubber lowers and the liners felt like they were conspiring on your behalf. Soldiers are practical theologians. They prefer miracles with mechanisms. One evening, as if despite every argument, the company got orders to hold a timber line that lay between 2 filigrees of drainage ditch. The snow, there was a liar in both directions. Looked thin and was deep. Looked safe and collapsed. They dug in, bayonets serving as picks. The rhythm of shovel move shovel, interrupted by the same curse in 4 dialects. On first watch, the wind came quartering and brought needles of ice with it. Misha stood, shifted again. Felt familiar. Panic climbed from toes to knees, the panic that says, this is when you start to lose things, you cannot grow back. He caught himself, squatted, pulled a liner, shoved the warmer one in, laced where the doubled eyelets made little cities of holes, and stood again into the needles. He was not comfortable. He was competent. At second watch, Kolya, the mortar gunner, who didn't joke anymore, walked the line, checking on the greenest boys, saying nothing about sights or arcs, only change them. Now, he tapped a boot toe with his stick the way a farrier tests a hoof. When he tapped felt, he said, stamp and breathe, then sit in the lee 5 minutes. When he tapped rubber, he nodded once and moved on. It turned into a small economy of survival. Change early, change often, dry against the skin, scuff on grit before ice, leave the felt to days when the cold is honest, and never believe a road just because it looks frozen. The company kept its feet, and by keeping its feet, kept its posts, its patrol routes, its little rectangles of the map that some colonel's pencil drew and erased and drew again. Behind them, on somebody else's map, lines that mattered were moving a few millimeters at a time. Convoys found lanes that weren't there in November. Depots in the north learned which crates to send to which units when the weather's moods were at their worst. None of that made it into any speech. What made it into memory was simpler. Toes that thawed with a sting rather than an ache. A man who didn't need to be carried the last kilometer. A patrol that came back with the right number of boots on the right number of feet. No one apologized to the boots. That isn't how soldiers work. They just stopped laughing as often and asked, in voices pitched to sound like they didn't care, "Any of those soft ones left?" For a comrade on Culvert watch. And the quartermaster, pencil shaved to a sliver, made another mark in the ledger that meant, in a language only he used, kept moving. The man who finally said it out loud was the last one anyone expected. Lieutenant Rogov was straight from a pre-war manual cap square on the head, scarf knotted to regulation, sentences crisp as ice. He wore his contempt like a badge and had an endless repertoire of phrases about character and endurance that made the younger men adopt the attentive face soldiers wear when they're thinking about something else. He had not laughed at the American boots. He had simply ignored them. On a morning that began like a photograph flat light, the trees etched with rime, Rogov led a company-sized probe along a line of birch and willow to feel out a German outpost that had started shooting more than listening. The plan was simple, the way good plans are. Drift forward in 2s and 3s through the underbrush, test for wire with bayonet tips, count voices, then decide if the day would be spent cutting a loaf or baking one. The air tasted of metal. Every footfall squeaked. They found the wire. They found the voices. What they didn't find was the ice they expected under a skim of drift where the tree line dipped toward a black trickle of stream. The first rank went into the knee. The second checked and spread. A third detoured left and right and discovered the same trap. A machine gun somewhere beyond the reeds coughed a polite burst that shaved bark and encouraged everyone to get lower than they already were. "Back along your prince," Rogov called, voice level, as if the world were cooperating. It wasn't. The prints were now little wells of slush, ankles numb, calves tightening into cramps. He chose a knob of higher ground, where last year's reeds stood dry and lay behind them with binoculars, counting the rhythm of the enemy gun. While the men worked their way free, he took his gloves off, pressed his palms to the lenses to warm them, and watched for the lull between bursts. The lull came with a ripple of steam from the gun's jacket. He turned, intending to push his third team through a sweeter patch. Kolya, the mortarman, was there first, already dragging 2 of the younger ones out by their webbing, cursing them in a tone that sounded like prayer. He shoved them toward a clump of alder, and then, remarkably, paused to jab the toe of each boot with his stick. Felt. He grunted and yanked at a third man's laces, double eyelets. American pattern, pulled a liner free, mashed it with both hands, shoved it under the man's tunic, and rammed the dry one in with his thumb. "Change early, fool," he said, not unkindly. The machine gun resumed its syllables. Rogov saw it all and said nothing. He directed a pair of rifles to pluck at the gun's crew, while the rest unglued their feet. When the gun fell silent for a longer count, he sent the right-hand element along a brittle arc of cattail, and the left on a crawl that kept ribs brushing the crust. By the time the sun lifted a finger's width, the probe had learned what it needed. 2 guns, 1 trench, 3 shortcuts. That would be death at night. They ghosted back along the birch rib, boot soles whispering on frost, and only when the trees hid them did anyone stand up and admit that their toes hurt like something bitten. At the farmhouse that served as a command post, roof patched with tar paper, stove patched with wire, Rogov shook the map so the ice would fall from its folds and mark the guns in pencil. He wrote neat notes about fields of fire and recommended a night party with wire cutters and a sack of grenades for the trench. Then, at the bottom, he wrote a single line that made the runner reread it twice. "Issue American boots with spare liners to patrol elements crossing the reed line." He did not look at anyone when he said, to the air, "They are soft." And then, as if correcting a child's grammar, "Soft is not a vice, not when the ground lies." The quartermaster pretended not to hear, and then spent the afternoon opening the loan stack and discovering it was suddenly official. He added a column to the ledger. cramped letters marching, Reed Patrol, Culvert Watch, Bridge Party, Wire Team. Besides some names, he added an asterisk that meant return likely. Not as punishment, but because he had learned to budget survival. The medic, who had run out of sermons the week before and had resorted to threats, found himself with fewer feet to unwrap and fewer smells that made everyone look away. He began to carry a little notebook of his own, not for poetry or women's addresses as in the months before, but for rules that he whispered to each new batch of replacements. Wear wool next to skin, change the liner before it drinks too much, keep the second set against your ribs, scuff before ice, never trust a road at noon. If you ignore me, he added, voice flat with practice, you will meet the sawbones in spring for things you will miss in summer. Convoys coughed and grumbled in the north. Someone said the cranes in Murmansk had frozen, then said they hadn't, then said nothing because rumor is a blanket too thin for nights like these. What arrived were more crates. Parkas stitched to a pattern that was not theirs, mittens with a trigger split, scarves soft as a grandmother's gentlest lie, and boots. Always the boots. Men who had laughed took pairs without looking at anyone. Men who had not laughed watched the laughter cease. The enemy did not care what sat on Russian feet. He tested with flares, with listening patrols, with a kind of long, needling shelling that makes a man feel like a fence post waiting for a thief. The company learned to hold the timber line and the reed line with equal stubbornness, to choose felt for marches where the cold stayed honest, and rubber lowers for nights when ice wore a gloss of water like a treachery. A little confidence returned, not the loud kind, but the functional sort that lets a man count to 60 without thinking between one breath and the next. There were losses, always. A boy from Tula who could whittle a spoon from any scrap went through, felt first, to pull a wounded man, and the river took him to the thigh in an instant he lived. But he learned the taste of metal that never leaves. A runner mistimed the scuff and wind sprint over a road skinned with glass and opened his eyebrow on a stone. These things would have happened in any boots. What changed was what didn't happen. Fewer nails gone black. Fewer mornings when a man woke and discovered his toes were somebody else's property now. Rogov changed too, though he hid it like a contraband. He stopped quoting the manual about character and began asking the quartermaster which sizes were left before he signed patrol orders. He stood at the stove one evening, hands laced behind him, and watched 2 liners steam on a string. "Your comrade taught you?" he asked Misha without turning. "No, comrade lieutenant," Misha said. "The weather taught me." Rogov's mouth moved as if to refuse the joke. Then he let it pass, which for him was the same as a smile. The thaw returned just long enough to make plans dangerous. The night the wire party went out, the wind came in from the west with damp teeth. 10 men went over the birch rib in a chain of shadows. 10 came back, boots wet but not ruined, feet burning the way feet burn when they are winning the argument. At the farm, the stove's glow turned faces theatrical. Someone offered Kolya a cigarette. He took it, looked at his boots as if they were a dog that had done a trick without being asked, and said nothing at all. That was how truth arrived in that winter. Not in proclamations, not in lectures, but in ledger marks, in fewer curses at dawn, in a lieutenant's neat note, in a medic's thinner notebook, in a mortar man who stopped trying to be funny because he no longer needed jokes to warm himself, and in the simple, stubborn fact that men kept moving when the ground chose to lie. By February, the ledger told a story even the proud could not ignore. Sick call for feet, non-battle, shrank to a column you could cover with a thumb. The medic who had once wrapped toes in gauze like candies no one wanted began using fewer rolls. Patrols came back with the same number of boots they left with. The quartermaster, who had made a private religion of numbers, laid 2 pages side by side, December and now. He didn't smile. He just sharpened his pencil and added another line to the temporary issue column that everyone knew was permanent. Winter, insulted by its own indecision, tried to reassert itself the honest way. A week of blue steel sky and frost that made birch bark crack like a match. The company moved in, felt on those days, content as men can be when their faces ache and their breath turns to lace. You could hear the snow, it squeaked. The old ways felt right, the world obeyed. Then, on the 8th dawn, the wind veered and the horizon smeared into a gray that had weight. By noon, the timber line dripped. By dusk, the road wore a gloss like a lie. The men shrugged into soft without talking about it. The enemy chose that night for a probe. It began with a flare that rose and hung, bleaching the timber into bone and shadow. Then a mortar or two, politely feeling for nerves. Then, the rustle that isn't wind, boots testing frozen ruts, branches touched by hands, a human cadence disguised poorly. Misha heard Kolya's breath nearby, hard, in and out, not from fear but from the work of being ready. Lieutenant Rogov moved along the line with the stoicism of a man who had already accepted that no plan survives first contact with weather. The first German shots stitched the parapet, then hunted for the gaps. The answering fire came ragged at first, then steadied into a rhythm. 2 shots, count, 2 more. The snow at the foot of the works wasn't snow anymore. It was a slurry that gripped and dragged. A runner went down and clawed back with fingers gone wooden. The wire team cursed softly in 3 accents and moved as if they were underwater. Felt would have ended them. The rubber lowers bought seconds, and seconds are the only currency on nights like this. When the enemy pushed a squad toward the culvert, the ground did more fighting than the men. Ice skinned with water is treachery and comedy at once. The Germans slid, recovered, slid again. One fell to a knee in a puddle that swallowed half the leg and howled in a way men don't if they expect to live long. Kolya's mortar coughed, and a shell bracketed the culvert with more splash than snow. Men on both sides cursed the same mud by different gods. Rogov watched for the moment that decides a small fight, the instant when a push becomes a rush or a reconsideration. He saw it when one of the enemy fired in place with the patience of a man who had trained on honest ground and then betrayed by footing, overcompensated and exposed shoulder and cheek. Left too low, Rogov murmured, and Misha, who had learned the river's language the hard way, put 2 where the lieutenant had drawn an invisible line. The push broke into a collection of individuals trying not to die. Afterward, no one boasted. They drank from blackened tins and pretended not to count their toes by pain. The medic walked the line like a priest, kneeling now and then to prod a soul through leather and ask, without looking up, changed? A yes meant nothing more had to be said. A no meant he pressed his lips together and said it for the last time. Do it now. He opened his little notebook and put a tick next to read line, Thaw, as if to remind himself the season had its own tactics. Word about the night's work climbed the telephone like warmth. A captain 2 villages over asked for details without admitting why. A major at regimental wrote advisable next to an old paragraph about footwear and sent it back down as if it had always been doctrine. In the typewritten order that followed, the neat language felt like surrender without humiliation. For outpost, culvert, and reed line patrols during thaw conditions, issue boots of the American pattern with removable liners, 2 liners per man, rotation to be enforced by squad leaders. Felt boots reserved for marches on established snow routes and static positions during sustained freeze. No one posted the order on the dugout wall. It arrived with bread and cartridges and the inevitable complaint about tobacco. The quartermaster copied the key line into his ledger, right where he kept his private column. Toes kept. The convoys in the north wrote their own story in smoke and wake. Rumor said a ship had limped in with a bow full of winter. Everything on deck rhymed so thick, a crowbar rang like a bell if you hit the rail. Rumor also said one had gone down in a night without a moon, and that men had climbed ice like glass to get 1 more crate topside. What mattered at this trench in this company was simple. More boxes with the same blocky letters arrived, and inside them were the same soft boots that had stopped being a joke. Habits hardened, the good kind. Liners lived under shirts, dry replaced wet on the half-watch. Men scuffed rubber on gravel before stepping onto ice. Squads checked each other's laces like they checked safety catches. On honest cold days, felt came out and morale surged with the squeak of proper winter. On liar days, rubber lowers took over without comment. The rightness of each choice showed up not in speeches, but in the speed with which a patrol moved and the number of times a man had to stop to convince his feet they still belonged to him. Rogov adjusted too, the way frozen rivers do, imperceptibly until the crack runs. He still wore his cap square, and he still wrote neat. But before he sent a team over the reed line, he ran a finger along the edge of a liner to feel if it was truly dry. He still said character sometimes, because men need certain words even when they don't believe them. Now, he paired it with technique, which few officers ever say out loud to privates. He even asked the quartermaster quietly, as if buying contraband if any size 43s remained. The quartermaster made a mark and said, "For a comrade," and no one felt the need to grin. A thaw came that should not have come, with rain that made roofs whisper. The wire party went out anyway and came back with all the feet it had taken. The ledger gained another tick. Somewhere far off, a general wrote about operational tempo and winter attrition and never once mentioned boots. That was fine. The men who did the walking had already learned what the winter wanted them to know. Hard is not the same as wise. And softness, if you understand what it's for, is a way to keep moving when the ground itself tries to stop you. Out on the road at dawn, the ice wore its gloss again, pretending to be a mirror for a sky the color of old tin. Misha stamped once, felt the familiar sting that promised blood returning and not leaving, and followed Rogov along a birch rib that had become theirs. Behind them, the stove ticked as liners steamed. Ahead of them, the reeds kept their secrets. Between the two, men in soft boots went to work in a hard war. The thaw took prisoners that week, but not the way anyone expected. On the third night of rain on ice, the Germans pushed again, testing the timberline with a neat little doctrine: flare, feeler squad, machine gun in reserve, a mortar shell or two for manners. They chose the same culvert, because maps teach habits. Rogov chose to do something manuals don't love. He sent a small party past the culvert through the reeds, where the ground kept its worst secrets. If the enemy expected a trade of bullets at the obvious point, they would find a hand tugging at their belt from behind. Misha went with the wire cutters, Kolya with 2 bombs for the mortar to forget at the right moment. They moved in the rhythm the company had learned in this weather. Scuff on gravel, test with the boot edge, place, breathe, place. The reeds combed their coats. Black water glittered like a bad promise. Twice they stopped to swap liners, wet out, warm in under their shirts in the lee of a stump. Not comfort, competence. They reached a hummocked patch where ice had mended and failed and mended again. Beyond it, voices. Beyond the voices, metal, the distinct rattle of ammunition boxes, and the slow, patient clack of a gun team that believed the ground beneath them was an ally. Misha lay on his side, breathing through scarf wool, tasting iron, watching boots in silhouette, tall leather, smooth soles, good on planks, maybe, God's own trap on glass. Rogov's timing, as usual, had a watchmaker's cruelty. The first Soviet shots at the culvert came a minute later than the enemy expected. Their gun opened, studied, disciplined bursts, and then paused, the way train crews pause. In that pause, Kolya slid a mortar round into a tube no one could see. The shell coughed, went long by design, and fell behind the German gun team exactly where panic would send them when the next trick landed. The trick was not artillery, it was men. Misha rose in the reeds as if the swamp itself had decided to argue. He and the second man went straight for the curved metal silhouette and the theodolite slowness of a tripod being moved by men fighting their own balance. He didn't run. He placed that careful step that ignores the brain's plea to hurry and trusts boots and practice. An enemy slipped, flailed, and in that flail turned his body enough that the muzzle went skyward. Misha was on him then, not cinematic, just hard and close, the way men fight when wind is cold and time is a small coin. The second German tried to pivot the gun and found his own feet had declared independence. It was over in a minute that felt like delivered mail, expected, and still a surprise. 2 prisoners, one shaking with fury at the ice more than at the Russians, the other shivering in a way that said he was already making a bargain with whatever God did weather. The gun lay on its side like a toppled idol, belt half fed, jacket steaming in the soft rain. They went back the way they had come, slower with the extra weight of men and steel. The Culvert fight had deflated. The enemy had decided wisdom was better than doctrine on a night that lied underfoot. Rogov met them at the birch rib. He looked once at the gun, once at the prisoner's boots, then at Misha's. He didn't smile. He said, "Put the gun where Kolya can speak through it tomorrow." Then after a breath, "Warm the prisoner's feet. We will want them to walk to the rear." In the farmhouse, steam rose from 3 pairs of liners on a string, 2 Russian, 1 German, wrung and surrendered for the night. The medic worked in his economy of movements, pressing a thumb to toes through socks, not to be kind, but to keep men usefully alive. He added a line to his little notebook read strike: enemy, MG, Thaw, and then, after a second, a word he almost never wrote: no frostbite. The interrogation was short. The prisoners were young and angry and wore their certainty like medals. You only came because the ground was bad. One of them spat in schoolroom Russian. Rogov nodded, as if being paid a compliment. "The ground is always bad," he said mildly, "for men who choose the wrong shoes." Word of the night's haul moved faster than any courier. A captain at battalion called to ask whether the gun was intact. A major at regiment asked the same question but meant, "How did you get there without swimming?" The quartermaster didn't ask anything. He drew a line beneath his last entry and wrote in his thin, stubborn hand, "Reed party returns. 12/12 toes kept." He drew a small square next to it and filled it in the private symbol he had adopted for lesson learned. The weather tried one more trick. A dry cold slammed in behind the rain, turning every puddle into a stone you could bruise a shin on. The timberline crackled. Breath turned to lace again, and the old comfort returned, felt tall and kind, marching on honest snow. Men went out on long patrols with rifles, comfortable against padded coats. They came back talking about distance and rhythm instead of ankles and curses. In the dugout, the soft boots sat in a neat row, liners clean, ready to be pulled when the ground changed its mind. A letter arrived from division, typed, correct, a sermon disguised as an order. It praised the unit's initiative in difficult ground, which meant nothing and everything. It directed that, during unstable winter conditions, rotation of removable liner boots will be enforced for outpost and patrol, which made official what men had already made true. It offered a last paragraph about Lend-Lease items to be employed according to local judgment, which was the closest a staff officer ever comes to saying we were wrong to laugh. No one pinned it to a wall. Rogov folded it twice and tucked it into the map case, where the river drew its lazy S and the culvert made its little bite in the road. He sent Kolya to sight the captured gun where it could speak in a new accent. He walked the line, tapping toes with his stick, asking the same quiet question. Changed? He stopped once at Misha, who was lacing up with the neatness of a habit that now lived in the hands. "You will take the reed path again if they come," Rogov said. It wasn't a question. Misha nodded, feeling that peculiar sting in his toes that promised blood returning and not leaving. At dawn, the sky was zinc and empty. The reeds clicked in a dry whisper. Somewhere far off, a train called humorless and necessary, bringing more crates with blocky letters, parkas, scarves, mittens with split fingers, and always boots that bent instead of broke. The men who wore them no longer argued with the word soft. They had given it a new shape. Soft was forgiving. Soft was prepared. Soft was how you kept moving in a winter that changed its mind. And across a map none of them would ever see. Little decisions like that, liners swapped in the lee of a stump, a step placed instead of thrown, an order written in a tidy hand added up to lines that moved the right way. Next, the thaw would come again, meaner. The enemy would try to use it harder. And the men who once laughed would show how a lesson, learned in the feet, becomes a weapon. By March, the thaw returned with a cruelty that felt personal. Snow didn't melt so much as surrender in clumps, revealing black ruts and pools that pretended to be shallow until they were not. The regiment was ordered to pinch a salient the enemy had pushed across a low marsh, an operation drawn in neat arrows by people whose boots, Rogov said quietly, had never met a reed. The plan hinged on speed between two ditches that had swollen into canals. The right company would fix the enemy at the culvert. The left would knife through the reeds, swing behind a machine gun nest on a hummock, and cut the road. If the swing slowed, the salient would hold. If the salient held, the enemy would be able to bring up sledge-mounted guns at dawn and turn the timberline into kindling. Rogov stacked the men for the left, Kolya with a tube and 3 bombs, Misha with cutters, 2 sappers with poles, 4 riflemen who could place a step as if spending a coin. He did not talk about courage. He talked about liners, laces, scuffing for tooth on the rubber lowers, swapping in the lee of willow clumps. You will change before you think you need to, he said, eyes on the reeds. Because when you think you need to, it's already late. They went at last light to learn the path, moving with the rhythm the winter had beaten into them. Scuff, test, place, breathe, count, place. The reeds hissed. Twice, Misha felt the old panic cold climbing from toes toward knees, then did the thing his hands had learned before his head. Wet liner out, warm one in. Laces pulled through the American eyelets that had once been a joke and were now a sort of prayer bead. He felt blood, argue, sting, return. At midnight, the right company opened like a door, cracking the culvert with disciplined fire. The enemy answered, textbook with textbook tracer threads, measured bursts, a flare that turned the marsh to tin. In that glare, the left company became shadow and arithmetic. At the hummock, 2 Germans wrestled a gun that kept trying to skate away from them. Kolya's first bomb landed short to teach their legs fear. His second landed long to herd them where Misha would appear. And then he did boots placed, not thrown hands, and steel, and breath, making a quick, precise end of a weapon that had decided to trust the ground. They cut the road with wire and hands. They held until the right could step onto the enemy's former parapet as if it had always been theirs. Dawn came as a smear. The sledge guns arrived to find no angles remaining. By midday, the salient was a story someone else would tell with blame. In the dugout, the medic set 3 pairs of liners to steam and wrote the smallest note in his little book. Swing complete. Toes. All present. The order that followed from regiment was clipped, almost embarrassed to be exact. For all operations across thawed ground, boots of American pattern with removable liners shall be issued to assault elements. 2 liners per man, change every half watch, squad leaders responsible to enforce. Felt reserved for sustained freeze. Doctrine amended accordingly. No one recited it. They lived it. The quartermaster penciled down to the last inch, closed his ledger once to warm his fingers on a mug. He looked at December's page and at the one he'd begun for March. Sick call for feet, thin as a matchstick. Returns from Reed patrols. Full count. He was not a poet, but he had begun to write a word next to certain names when he issued the soft boots. Kept. It meant what it said. Convoys fought their own war, far north, rumor said. A ship had come in, rhymed so thick that men chipped ice from the winches with hammers until sparks flew. Rumor said another never arrived at all, but the crates kept coming, blocky letters stenciled in paint that resisted sleet. Parkas, mittens split for triggers, scarves that didn't itch, and boots that bent. It wasn't that the old ways died. On days when the world returned to blue steel and honest squeak, the felt rose like a remembered hymn. Men marched far and came back bragging about rhythm and distance, the good boasting that oils a hard life. Then the liar weather returned, and without a word men reached for the other pair. because wisdom learned through the feet does not argue with the mouth. The enemy adapted too. Their patrols came cautious on Thaw nights, stepping with hatred at the ground. They tried boards, then gave up the boards, because boards float and betray. They tried dragging branches ahead of them to test for ice, then abandoned that, because it makes a noise the reeds gossip about. They learned to respect the culvert and to fear the hummock they could not see. "They know we are there," Kolya said one dawn, rubbing his hands over the stove. "They just do not know where the ground is." In April, a general came through in a coat that looked like a sentence. He stood at the reed line, boots on a plank the sappers had humored him with, and asked tidy questions about arcs and ammunition and line of sight. Rogov answered neatly. The general squinted at the marsh and made a face as if smelling a bad argument. "And the boots?" he said at last, as if the word wounded him. Rogov did not smile. "We use felt when the cold is honest," he said. "We use these when the cold lies." The general nodded once, the smallest of pardons, then stepped back onto firm ground that somebody else had scouted. That night, the ledger grew another mark in the private column. Lesson adopted. The medic closed his little book and, for the first time in months, wrote something that was not a rule. We keep what we can keep. Misha, lacing in the lamplight, thought of the first day he held the soft pear and looked for nails that weren't there. He thought of the reed line as a kind of teacher, patient, and cruel. He thought, not unkindly, of the men who had laughed. The thaw would come again. It always does. And when it did, the company would move the way winter had taught them. Not bravely, not beautifully correctly. They would scuff for tooth. They would change before they needed. They would treat softness as a tool and hardness as a truth that only applied when the world deserved it. Across the map, lines that mattered moved the right way for reasons no communique would list. But here, at this culvert and that hummock, the reason felt as plain as cold. Men who learned with their feet could keep a promise that plans alone could not. In spring, when the snow finally quit its lying and turned to honest mud, the boots would dry by a different stove, and a new crate would open, and some replacement from a city without reeds would laugh at the word soft. Someone Misha, maybe? Or Kolya with his new patient voice would shrug and show him where to tuck the spare liners under his shirt. Because that is how war teaches what manuals can't, one cold toe saved at a time, until the lesson becomes doctrine and the joke becomes a habit that keeps you alive. Spring tried to make everyone forget. Tracks reappeared where roads had been, the birch, sap ran, men unbuttoned one button and pretended not to enjoy it. New faces joined the company, cheeks still round, boots still stiff, eyes that hadn't learned the habits of the reed line. They came with the same jokes the veterans had once told. "American dance shoes," one said, thumbing the padded tongue. Kolya, patient now in a way no one would have guessed, showed him the trick with the spare liner and didn't bother answering the joke. The regiment shifted forward to a village shaped like a crooked nail, one street, two wells, three stoves that drew poorly. The old dugout by the culvert went to another company. The reeds belonged to someone else. On the wall of the new command hut, Rogov pinned a fresh map and found, with the mixture of weariness and relief soldiers reserved for luck, that the stream here ran almost straight. Less treachery, different traps. A German leaflet blew into the yard one afternoon. Blue-gray paper with neat black letters. It sneered at foreign gifts, enumerated them in a list that tried to sting. Boots, mittens, parkas, soup. It suggested the Red Army could not walk or eat without the West. Misha read it once and handed it to the quartermaster, who folded it into his ledger at the month divider like a bookmark and went on sharpening his pencil. "Foreign gifts," he said softly, as if testing a floorboard. "Feet are not politics." The first real rain of spring hit like good news and bad news at once. Snow slumped, puddles merged, the wells ran brown, and the air smelled like metal and thawed earth. Orders arrived. Push reconnaissance past the old line, find the new wire, count the guns, and mark the places a company could fit without being seen. It was the same job, written in softer ink. They went with the same rhythm: scuff for tooth, tests with the edge of the sole, place and breathe, change liners before the brain winds. Rogov had turned the method into a list on the back of his notebook technique for lyre ground, and he made the newest squad leaders copy it out by hand. "You cannot command what your feet don't know," he said in the voice he used when he wanted men to pretend the sentence was their own thought. Beyond the village, the fields were a chessboard of dry hummocks and black mirrors. A new lieutenant from regimental staff, eager to help and eager to be seen helping, suggested duckboards. Kolya smiled without mirth and laid one down, then stepped on the far end to show how it seesawed and drank itself under. "Good for parades," he said, returning the old joke with a gentleness that made it a warning. That night, they took a listening post past a stand of willow, where the ground said yes when it meant no. The enemy had shifted his arcs to watch a road that no longer mattered. Doctrine lagged behind weather. Misha's team went around the blind spot in a crescent that would have been impossible in felt. They lay with chins on forearms and listened long enough to learn the machine gun's appetite, the sentry's cough, the way the section leader's boots told his rank. On the way back, a replacement stepped where the world had not yet decided what it wanted to be and went to the knee with a sharp cry. Kolya's hand found his collar. "Slow is fast," he grunted, pulling, then made the boy sit. "Swap liners. Breathe until the sting became promising rather than frightening." It took 5 minutes they had and didn't have. It kept 2 toes a man would need in June. By May, the ledger was a quiet victory. Sick call for feet. A line so small, it looked like an afterthought. Returns from Reed patrols. Full. Week after week. The quartermaster added a habit. A tick next to a name the day he issued a pair, and another when the pair came back, with the man smiling or pretending not to. Between ticks, he wrote the same small word he'd started in winter. Kept. He did not show this to anyone. He didn't have to. Supply changed tone. The convoys that had fought the Northern Sea sent different crates now. Tools and wire instead of parkas. Tins of grease instead of scarves. Fuel in drums with warning stencils. But always, among the practicals, there were boots and liners. Men took them without ceremony, because ceremony is for before or after. In between, there are lists. The enemy learned a little and then a lot. Their patrols came at dusk rather than night, when the marsh tells fewer lies. They adopted our rhythm in a stiff way. Test, place, breathe. They wore clamps on heels for ice that wasn't there. They cursed in accents that made the reeds shiver the same as ours. Once, in the gray washerwoman's hour before dawn, Misha came face to face with a German scout at 40 paces, both with a foot in water and a hand on a trunk. Neither fired. Both backed away along their own prints, careful as men carrying full bowls. The order came back stamped and filed, a paragraph added to the book that turns men into units. It read like any other paragraph, dry, accurate, trying not to say we learned this hard. That was fine. The company already knew where the lesson lived. In the read line. In a runner who didn't need to be carried. In a boy from the city who never again laughed at the word soft after one night with blood returning to his toes. In June, as the world turned green without asking anyone's leave, the boots found one more life. Men split worn liners into clean, even foot wraps for summer marches. The rubber lowers shrugged through the new mud, the same way they had in the old. Misha made a joke he would not have dared in January. "These Americans build for weather that can't make up its mind," Kolya snorted. "Then they built for ours." A train came through with officers who smelled like starch and paper. One young, well-intended, asked Rogov how the company had reduced non-battle foot casualties by 3/4. Rogov surprised himself by answering simply, without the phrases he'd once collected like medals. "We stopped arguing with the ground," he said. "We started listening to it. And we took what worked, even if it bent." He did not say we were wrong to laugh, because war doesn't leave room for confessions that don't move a line. He did not say softness saved us, because he knew how that would sound to a clerk. He said the thing that men who had lived the winter would recognize. We kept moving. That night, under a sky that finally remembered stars, Misha sat on the stoop of the new hut and rewound his laces with the unconscious care of a habit that has become belief. The reeds across the way kept their black secrets. The road, dry for once, pretended kindness. From far off north, always north, a low thunder said trains and cranes and crates, and men were still doing the work that makes small victories add up. He thought of the first day, of the laughter, of the sting as blood returns, of Kolya's hand on his collar, of Rogov's neat note issue the American boots, and he allowed himself a small, private smile measured in millimeters. Winter had proved them wrong. The ground had proved them wrong. Their own feet had proved them wrong. And now the lesson lived where it mattered, not in the mouth, but in the step. By midsummer, the lesson had traveled farther than the company. It moved the way all useful things move in an army. Sideways, first platoon to platoon, company to company, then upward in the measured, reluctant steps of doctrine. Battalion choreographed crossings with soft boots as deliberately as they scheduled artillery. Regiment added a line to standard kit for Thaw patrols, 2 liners per man in forced rotation. Division's quartermaster, a man allergic to adjectives, drew a new arrow on his flowchart for where the crates should go first when the barometer sulked. In a staff briefing thick with maps and fuel tables, someone said, "Foot survivability in unstable ground," as if it were an old term and not an invention of this winter. No speech marked the change. It lived in small, stubborn facts. A bridge party finished on time because the men could feel their toes. An ambush in the alder went off when it should because the runners arrived with messages intact and ankles unbroken. A company that should have been late was not, because it treated the Thaw like a hostile general and adjusted accordingly. The ledger at the aid post kept shrinking its feet non-battle column until it resembled a private apology written in numbers. And the laughter? It didn't vanish. It evolved. New men still cracked wise when the blocky letters appeared on crates. Veterans still rolled their eyes at the doubled eyelets and the padded tongues. But the punchline had changed. When someone said soft, nobody heard weak anymore. They heard forgiving. They heard ready. They heard the thing that keeps you from paying interest on a mistake for the rest of your life. War found new ways to collect on old debts. The enemy learned, too, and began to choose dusk over midnight, timber over reeds, the known treachery over the unknown. Their patrol leaders shortened steps, widened stances, put their best men at the place where ground lied most often. You could hear the adjustment in how quickly a flare went up after the first splash. You could see it in the boards abandoned at the marsh edge, in the branches cut for testing and then tossed aside because the sound betrayed them. Adaptation met adaptation. The balance of surprise leaned toward those who had learned with their feet first. In July, the company was ordered to cover an engineers team cutting a bypass under a stand of willow where the old road had gone soft enough to drown a cart. It was unglamorous work, the kind that never makes it into songs. The engineers hacked and staked. The riflemen listened for metal and breath. Twice the sky blew itself clean and tried on a hard blue, and twice it changed its mind by dusk. The rhythm returned. Scuff, test, place, swap before you think you need to. Treat the ground as an argument you can win but never ignore. The bypass held. The convoy fuel, shells, crates with letters that did not look like home rolled through and did not stop for anything but breath. A letter reached the company from a man who had passed through months back, a runner transferred to signals, now writing from a cleaner dugout full of wires. He wrote about the odd pride of hearing units call in on time, despite the weather, of tracing little pulses that meant we got there, even tonight. He thanked no one in particular, and everyone in general, and he ended with a line that made Rogov stare a second longer than he meant to. We are less brave now, and more correct, and it saves more lives than I can say. Summer's honest mud replaced winter's lies. The soft boots found use there too, shrugging through ruts that tried to eat souls. Liners, worn thin with service, were cut into clean foot wraps for long marches. The reed line whispered fewer secrets, but the habit remained. Men checked each other's laces as they checked safeties. Squad leaders tapped toes with a stick. The quartermaster's ledger kept its small, private word beside names, kept and filled the page with it. One afternoon, a staff visitor arrived, the kind of officer you can smell before you see. All paper and starch and correctness. He asked his tidy questions about arcs and ammunition and how many meters the company could cover at a sprint. He gestured vaguely at the fields and said, almost against his will, and the footwear, the foreign pattern, this method. Rogov answered without ornament. We use felt when the cold is honest, he said. We use these when it lies. We change before we need. We scuff for tooth. We keep moving. The officer nodded as if hearing a familiar hymn sung in a new key and wrote nothing down, which is sometimes how ideas survive. That night, Misha sat on a step and rewove his laces with the unconscious care of a ritual that has outlived winter. He remembered lifting the first pair from the crate and searching for nails that weren't there. He remembered Kolya's hand on his collar in the reeds, the medic's dry voice saying, now, Rogov's neat line on the map case, issue the American boots with spare liners to the patrol, and the sting in his toes that meant blood returning, not leaving. He thought about laughter and how it can be a shield and a blade and sometimes a blindfold. The old Culvert belonged to another company now. The reeds had new listeners. The crate lids still pried up with a groan that smelled like salt and tar. Somewhere far north, cranes swung in weather no map can draw. And men chipped ice from rails to free a crate that would end up as a tick in a quartermaster's book, and a man's toes saved on a night when doctrine lagged behind weather again. The war was too large for any of them to see. The lesson was small enough to live in the foot. Winter had proved them wrong. The ground had proved them wrong. Their own steps had proved them wrong. And the price of being wrong had been paid in full once, so they would not pay it twice. That is why, when men with round cheeks arrive and laugh at letters they can't pronounce, and leather that bends, the veterans do not argue. They show, quietly, how to tuck a spare liner under a shirt, how to scuff before ice, how to swap before you think you need to, how to treat softness as a tool and hardness as a condition, not a virtue. They hand down technique the way someday they will hand down stories. One small, correct act at a time. Because war is a long, indecent negotiation with elements and errors, and victory often begins with the unglamorous decision to put the right boots on the right feet before the ground makes its case. And now, let me leave you with the question that outlasted that winter. When the world lies under you, when the plan says run and the ground says move correctly, do you cling to the old hardness that feels brave? Or do you choose the forgiving thing that keeps you and your comrades alive long enough to see the map change? They did not carve a medal for what changed that winter. They wrote it into the way men walked. By autumn, the soft boots had become invisible, visible only in what did not happen. Patrols no longer bled time at the reed line. Bridge guards finished their watches with 10 toes that still belonged to them. Runners arrived when the plan assumed they would. And so plans could be bolder without being foolish. The battalion's after-action sheets shrank a column nobody boasts about: non-battle foot losses. In a war that measured victory by kilometers and railheads and towns with broken names, the quiet miracle was measured in steps. The lesson radiated outward. Supply officers stopped treating footwear like clothing and started treating it like mobility. A dull man with an excellent mind in division logistics drew a box around removable liners on a flowchart and connected it to tempo. The connection held, doctrine caught up, and pretended it had known all along. It didn't matter. The company had known first, because the ground had told them. What the enemy learned was visible too. Their patrols no longer dashed, they placed. They picked dusk over midnight, timber over reeds. the known treachery over the unknown. You could hear the respect in the speed of their flares and see it in the boards abandoned at marsh edges. Once, at gray dawn, Misha spotted a German scout across a slick ditch. Careful feet, short steps, fury at the earth shared across 30 paces. The man looked up. For a second, their boots were mirrors. Then both vanished along their own prints, as men do who have met the same teacher and survived the lesson. The crates kept coming, parkas in winter, grease and wire in spring, fuel and steel when summer went honest. Always boots, always liners. On some night in the north, a crane would swing in a snow that made iron cry, and a longshoreman would chip ice off a winch while cursing 3 governments by nickname so that, months later, a quartermaster could make a mark in a ledger next to Reed Patrol and write his private word, kept. History would write paragraphs about tanks and trains and tonnage. It would not waste ink on a pencil line in a cold hut. It should have. Rogov changed in ways no photograph could capture. The cap was still square. The notes were still neat. But when he briefed a movement over lyre ground, he taught the technique itself. Scuff for tooth. Test with the sole edge. Place, breathe, place. Swap liners before the thought becomes a need. He had stopped worshiping hardness for its own sake. Hardness, he'd learned, is a condition of weather and steel, not a virtue in a man. Virtue was choosing the forgiving tool when the world would not forgive your mistake. Kolya became a patient instructor, a man who could insult you kindly into survival. He still cursed like a priest of a very old faith, but the curses were a way to hold a frightened boy still long enough to swap a liner and save 2 toes a mother might kiss again. The medic's little notebook got thin on rules and fat on ticks that meant no frostbite today. The quartermaster's ledger filled with names followed by that one small word. Misha, whose first instinct had been to search the American boot for nails that weren't there, laced and unlaced by feel now. A ritual made of lesson and gratitude. A general came and went, paper, starch, good intentions, asking correct questions about arcs and ammunition. On his way out, he hesitated, as if a different question had wandered into his mouth uninvited. And the foreign pattern, he said. Rogov answered as a man answers about a spade in a field. We use felt when the cold is honest, he said. We use these when it lies. We change before we need. We keep moving. The general nodded as if he had signed something important and walked back to a car that knew only roads that had already been argued with. Years later, after more towns with broken names, after rivers you could cross and rivers you could not, after letters that began with triumph and ended with absence, someone would ask Misha what he remembered most about that winter. He would not say glory. He would not even say fear. He would say the sound, the hiss of sleet on ice that lies, the squeak of honest cold, the little wet slap of a liner wrung out in lamplight, the soft scrape of a rubber lower scuffed on gravel before stepping onto glass, the sounds of a lesson entering the body through the feet until it lived in the step. There is a story people like to tell about wars, that victory belongs to the hardest. Perhaps sometimes it does. But that winter gave the company a different catechism. Victory belongs to the most correct, to the ones who stop arguing with ground and weather and start listening, who choose the tool that forgives a human margin, who let their pride be smaller than their duty so their steps can be longer than their fear. The men who laughed at soft boots did not write apologies. Soldiers don't. They handed down a technique instead. They showed a replacement, how to tuck a spare liner under a shirt, how to scuff for tooth, how to place a step when everything in you wants to rush, how to treat softness as a weapon when the earth itself takes the enemy's side. That is what survived. That is what crossed from one winter to every other kind of winter a person meets. And that is why, when the thaw came again, and the map asked for one more line to be moved in a place with reeds and lies, the company did not reach for speeches. They reached for the boots that bent because softness, understood, is how you keep faith with each other when the world under you refuses to keep faith at all. If you've marched this far with them, here's the only question worth asking yourself. When the ground in your life starts lying, when the plan demands speed and the reality demands precision, do you cling to the old hardness that feels brave? Or do you pick the forgiving thing that keeps you and your people moving until the map finally changes?